Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we are turning our lens on a piece of work that doesn't just ask us to, learn new facts, but to fundamentally inspect the machinery of how we remember the past. We are looking at Black AF History, the Un-Whitewashed Story of America by Michael Harriot.
And honestly, machinery is absolutely the right word here, because usually when we pick up a history book, we expect a timeline.
Right.
You know the drill. Columbus sails the ocean blue in 1492, George Washington chops down a cherry tree, Lincoln wears a tall hat, and then boom, suddenly we have iPhones. It feels linear. It feels inevitable.
It feels neutral.
Yeah.
And that is the key. We are taught to view history as a simple record of things that happened. But Michael Harriot is doing something, well, profoundly different in this book. He isn't just correcting facts. He's exposing the operating system.
The operating system.
He argues that the history we all know, the standard American narrative, is a design product. It's what he calls a narrative infrastructure.
I love that term, narrative infrastructure, but it also sounds a little, I don't know, a little ominous. It sounds like something out of the Matrix. When you say it's a designed product, what does that actually mean for you, the listener?
Okay, think about a highway system. A highway isn't nature, it's infrastructure. Someone designed it.
Sure.
They decided which towns get an exit ramp and which towns get completely bypassed. They decided where the fast lanes go. They decided who has easy access to the city center and who gets cut off by a concrete wall.
Right. It's all intentional.
It's all intentional.
Yeah.
And Harriot is arguing that American history is built the exact same way. Specific people at specific times built a narrative highway to get to a very specific destination. And that destination isn't truth. The destination is national cohesion.
So the goal of the history book isn't really to tell you what happened. The goal is to make you feel like a citizen of a legitimate, noble country.
Precisely. The system prioritizes stability over accuracy. It privileges specific actors, usually white settlers, and it erases others, all to maintain the legitimacy of the state. If you start pulling at the threads of that legitimacy, the whole tapestry threatens to unravel.
And that's the crisis he's addressing.
That's the crisis.
And the guy pulling at the threads is Michael Harriot. We should probably introduce him before we dive into the cannibalism. And yes, everyone, buckle up. We are absolutely going to talk about the cannibalism later.
We have to.
But Harriot himself is such an interesting figure. He calls himself a blurred, a black nerd.
He does. He's a journalist, a cultural critic, and a humorist.
Yeah.
And that humor is so vital because the subject matter is, it's incredibly heavy.
For sure.
But his entry point into this whole way of thinking, the systems thinking, it comes from his childhood. He talks about growing up in South Carolina, which is, deep, deep Confederate country. But inside his house, there was a specific room.
The middle room.
The middle room. It's such a powerful concept.
It really is. So he describes this room right in the center of his childhood home. His grandfather had lined it with oak shelves, floor to ceiling. And it wasn't filled with, like, the Britannica or the standard textbooks you'd expect.
Yeah.
It was filled with Black Thought, W.E.B. Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson, J.A. Rogers, Zora Neale Hurston.
It was basically an archive of a parallel reality.
Exactly. So Harriot says he was effectively homeschooled in this room before he ever really engaged with the public school system. He calls it his primary education.
Right.
And because of that, when he finally went to a regular school and opened a history textbook, he didn't just see history, he saw a fabrication.
And this is the crucial point. He had what, sociologists might call double consciousness right from the start.
Yeah.
He compares standard American history to a funhouse mirror.
That's a great analogy.
Most of us, you, me, probably most of our listeners, we grew up inside the funhouse. We spent our lives looking at that distorted reflection, trying to make sense of it, trying to unbend the mirror to somehow see the truth.
Right, trying to correct the image from the inside.
Exactly. But Harriot's advantage was that, because of the middle room, he never had to unbend the mirror. He was looking at the actual object, the reality of Black survival, and looking at the mirror at the same time. He could see the distortion as a design feature, not a bug.
He has this great line where he says, the difference between the middle room history and school history isn't just a difference of perspective. It's that one is a mythology designed to make white people feel good, and the other is, well, it's the receipts.
And that brings us to our mission for this deep dive. We aren't just going to retell the stories in the book. We're going to analyze the narrative infrastructure he describes.
Okay.
We're going to look at the architecture. How was the story built? The incentives. Why was it built that way? And the outcomes. What happens to a society that runs on a corrupted operating system?
Okay, let's start at the foundation, the origin story. Every superhero needs one, and I guess every nation needs one. For America, it's the story of the settler.
Section 1. The narrative infrastructure, settlers versus invaders.
We all know the beat. 1607 Jamestown, 1620 Plymouth Rock. The narrative is always plucky Englishmen arrive on the shores of a new world.
A new world, as if nothing was there.
Exactly. And they are stoic, they are pious, they roll up their sleeves, chop down the trees, and just carve a civilization out of the wilderness through sheer grit and the Protestant work ethic.
That is the heroic settler myth in a nutshell.
Yeah.
It frames the settler as the protagonist,
Mm-hmm.
competent, self-sufficient, and, basically ordained by God to be there.
But Harriot looks at the data. He looks at who these people actually were. And this is where the system starts to glitch, because these weren't rugged survivalists.
No, not even close. In Jamestown specifically, a huge portion of them were gentlemen.
And we should clarify, gentlemen back then didn't mean what it means now.
Totally different. Now, in 21st century English, a gentleman is just, a polite guy who opens the door for you.
Right.
But in 17th century England, it was a class designation. It meant a man who did not work with his hands. It meant a man whose social status depended on never doing manual labor.
So you have a boatload of guys showing up in the wilderness, and their superpower is entitlement.
Essentially.
Hmm.
They brought valets, they brought footmen, they brought jewelers and goldsmiths because they were under the impression they were just going to, pick gold up off the ground.
Wow.
They didn't bring farmers. They didn't bring carpenters. They had no useful skills for that environment.
And they landed in a place that Harriot points out was incredibly lush. The indigenous people, the Powhatan Confederacy, had been living there sustainably for thousands of years. There was game, there was fish, there was fertile soil. It was a paradise. And what did the settlers do?
They starved.
They starved to death.
It's called the starving time. It is a period that is mentioned in textbooks, but usually as a time of great hardship or a test of faith.
Right, it's romanticized.
It's completely romanticized. But Harriot forces us to look at the visceral reality of it. Why were they starving in what was basically a supermarket? Because they were incompetent. They didn't know how to hunt the game. They didn't know how to fish. They didn't know how to farm the local crops. They drank brackish water and got dysentery.
And this is where we have to talk about the powdered wife. Because I read this and I had to put the book down for a second. I thought, is he exaggerating for effect? But he's quoting the historical record.
He is quoting Captain John Smith and George Percy. These are primary sources.
So tell the listeners what happened, because this isn't in the Thanksgiving pageant.
No. During the winter of 1609-1610, things got so bad in Jamestown that the social order completely collapsed. They ate their horses, then they ate their dogs, then they ate the leather of their boots and belts.
Okay, already grim.
Then they started digging up corpses from the graveyard to eat them.
Oh my God.
And finally, there is the account of a man who murdered his pregnant wife, salted her, powdered her like you would cure a ham and ate her.
He powdered his wife.
Yes. And when the leaders of the colony discovered this, they burned him at the stake for his crime. But the act happened. Cannibalism was happening in the founding settlement of America.
Okay, so here is the systems question. If I did that, or more importantly, if the indigenous people had been recorded doing that, what would the history books say?
Oh, the narrative would be entirely different.
Hmm.
If the Powhatan had been eating each other, the history books would call them the cannibal cults of Virginia.
Of course.
It would be used as definitive proof that they were savages who needed to be conquered. It would be the moral justification for the entire invasion.
But because it was the white settlers.
It is framed as a tragedy. It is framed as a struggle. The narrative sanitizes the horror because the horror, the incompetence, it conflicts with the competent protagonist myth that the entire national story is built on.
Harriot has this line that I highlighted. I have it right here. The difference between a settler and a burglar is just who writes the police report.
It just cuts right to the core of the incentive structure. Why does the system maintain the heroic settler myth, despite the evidence of incompetence and literal cannibalism? Because of the incentive of nation building.
Right.
To justify the seizure of an entire continent, the people doing the seizing must be seen as enlightened and civilizing.
You can't say, we are taking this land because we are hungry, incompetent failures who need to steal your corn to survive.
Exactly. That doesn't look good on a plaque. So the narrative has to flip. It erases the pre-existing civilizations. It frames survival not as what it was, which was initially indigenous charity and later theft and violence, but as divine providence.
And this brings us to the next massive piece of the system, which I think is maybe the most technically fascinating part of the book. We move from the incompetence of the settlers to the expertise of the people they enslaved.
Section 2, intellectual property theft.
This was a huge aha moment for me, because usually when we talk about slavery in America, even in the more, woke version of history, we talk about stolen labor.
Right. Muscle.
We talk about muscle, backbreaking work, cotton picking, sugarcane.
Yes. The system outcome usually reduces black people to labor inputs, like batteries for the machine, just raw physical energy.
But Harriot argues that is a fundamental lie. It wasn't just muscle, it was technology, it was expertise. And the best example, and I want us to really get into the weeds on this, is the gold of Carolina, rice.
Rice is the perfect case study. So let's set the scene. South Carolina, late 1600s, you have these British planters, families like the Draytons and the Middletons. They've been granted massive tracts of land by the king. They're called lords proprietors, but they have a huge problem.
They're broke.
They are failing miserably. They are trying to grow stuff that English people know how to grow. They tried silk, didn't work. They tried citrus, didn't work. They tried growing grapes for wine, total failure. They're dying of malaria. They have no cash crop, and the colony is on the verge of collapse. It's basically Jamestown 2.0.
And then suddenly rice happens. And the history books usually say something like, the planters discovered that the land was suitable for rice.
Which is a sentence where the passive voice is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Was discovered.
Right. By whom?
Because English people do not grow rice. They have no cultural history of rice cultivation. They live on a rainy island where you grow wheat and barley. They had zero idea how to grow rice.
And growing rice isn't like, growing tomatoes in your backyard. You don't just throw some seeds in the dirt and wait.
No, it is hydraulic engineering on a massive scale. It requires a complete alteration of the landscape. You not to clear swamps. But more importantly, you have to manage the water. You need to build a complex system of levees, dams, and sluice gates. They were called trunks.
Okay, explain the trunks, because Harriot really geeks out on this a bit, and it's fascinating.
It's a pressure-based valve system. It's brilliant. You have to use the tidal flow of the river. When the tide comes in, the fresh water from upriver backs up. You open the trunk gate to flood the field. When the tide goes out, you open the gate the other way to drain the field. You have to keep the water at specific depths at specific times during the plant's life cycle. If it's too deep, the rice drowns. If it's too shallow, the weeds take over. And God forbid any salt water from the ocean gets in, because the entire crop dies.
So it's precision agriculture. It was engineering. And the British guys had absolutely no clue how to do it.
None. But you know who did?
The West Africans.
Specifically, people from what was known as the Rice Coast, modern-day Sierra Leone, Senegambia, the Windward Coast. They had been growing rice using this exact tidal irrigation technology for centuries. It was their specialty.
And this is where the intellectual property argument becomes so powerful. Harriot points out that the slave traders knew this. This wasn't accidental.
No, it was targeted headhunting. The planters in Carolina were writing letters to the slave traders in Charleston and saying, don't send us people from the Bight of Biafra, send us people from the Rice Coast. They weren't just buying muscle, they were buying engineers, they were buying agricultural scientists.
And get this, he mentions the gender component, which is amazing. In most slave markets, men were priced higher because they were seen as physically stronger.
Right, for cane fields or whatever.
But in the Carolina markets, for a period of time, African women from the Rice Coast were priced at a premium. They cost more than the men.
Because in those specific West African societies, the women were the agricultural experts. They held the knowledge of the seed selection and the cultivation cycle. They were the consultants.
So the Carolina gold rice boom that built the immense, staggering wealth of Charleston and Savannah, that wasn't English ingenuity. That was African technology stolen, transplanted, and scaled up using enslaved African bodies.
Well, look at the system output. The narrative calls it Carolina gold. It credits the white planters. The history books talk about the ingenuity of the Southern planter class. It completely erases the transfer of technology. It treats the Africans as if they were just the mules pulling the plow, not the architects who designed the entire irrigation system.
It's like if I stole your software code, became a billionaire, and then hired you as the janitor at my new headquarters, and the history books called me a genius coder.
That is exactly what it is. And Harriot shows us this pattern repeating everywhere. It's not just rice. It's the cowboys.
Oh, the cowboys. This is one of those things that once you hear it, you can't unhear it. It just clicks.
The image of the cowboy is the ultimate symbol of white American masculinity. Don Wayne, the Marlboro Man, rugged individualism.
But the word itself, cowboy.
Harriot breaks down the etymology. In the colonial and antebellum South, white men who worked with cattle were called cattlemen or buckaroos. The term boy was the diminutive, the disrespectful term used for enslaved men, regardless of their age.
So the cowboy was literally the enslaved man tasked with herding the cattle.
It was his job title. But it wasn't just the name, it was the technique. Again, the British didn't herd cattle in open scrubland. They had small pastures with stone fences. But the Fulani people of West Africa, they were the masters of open-range herding. They knew how to move massive herds over difficult terrain. They used specific calls. They used whips. They used dogs. They knew how to use salt licks to manage the herd's movement.
So the whole Longhorn culture of Texas and the Deep South is essentially Fulani culture.
But the system bleaches it. The cowboy becomes the white hero, and the black origin is completely erased from the popular imagination.
And we can't forget medicine. This one feels especially relevant given, well, everything in the last few years with public health. Harriot tells the story of Onesimus.
This is a story that should be in every single textbook. So Boston, 1721, a massive smallpox outbreak is tearing through the city. It's a death sentence for most people.
And you have Cotton Mather, the famous Puritan preacher, a major figure. He has an enslaved man named Onesimus. And Mather asks him, "Have you ever had smallpox?"
And Onesimus says, essentially, yes and no. He explains that in his village in Africa, they do this thing. They take a little bit of the pus from a sick person's sore, scratch the skin of a healthy person and put the pus in. The person gets a little bit sick, but then they are immune forever.
He was describing inoculation, the direct precursor to vaccination.
He was. It was established medical practice where he came from. And Mather, to his credit, actually listened. He wrote about it. He tried to get the white doctors in Boston to adopt the practice.
And what was the reaction from the medical establishment?
Outrage. Violent outrage. A local doctor, a guy named Zabdiel Boylston, started doing it, and someone threw a bomb through his window.
A bomb.
Yes. The press called it African magic and devil worship.
Yeah.
They could not accept that a life-saving medical breakthrough could come from a so-called savage.
But it worked. The numbers showed it worked.
It saved Boston. The mortality rate for those who got inoculated was drastically lower. But here is the erasure of expertise again. When we learn about the history of medicine, do we hear about Onesimus? Or do we hear about Edward Jenner and the milkmaids in England decades later?
We hear about Jenner.
The black intellectual contribution is minimized, footnoted, or completely ignored.
So why? What is the core incentive here? Why not just say, hey, thanks for the rice technology and the vaccine, now get back to work? Why does the system have to pretend they didn't invent it?
This is the critical systems question. You have to look at the moral justification for slavery. The brand of the American slave system was the civilizing mission.
The idea that these are backward, savage people who need the white man to take care of them, to teach them Christianity, to guide them.
Exactly. The narrative was, we are feeding them, clothing them, and teaching them how to be civilized. It's a benevolent, paternalistic institution. That's the sales pitch. But if you admit the truth...
If you admit that the white man is starving and the African man is teaching him how to farm, how to vaccinate, and how to herd cattle,
then the hierarchy completely flips. The civilizing mission is exposed as a fraud. You aren't civilizing them, you are parasitizing them. You are extracting their technology and their labor while claiming moral superiority. The system cannot sustain that contradiction.
it would collapse under the weight of its own hypocrisy.
So the narrative must erase their intellect to preserve the justification for their enslavement. It's a foundational piece of the architecture.
It's protecting the intellectual property of white supremacy itself.
Precisely. And that protection mechanism extends to how the system handles the most natural human response to that oppression, resistance. Because if these people are so smart and you're treating them so badly, surely they would fight back.
And they did, constantly. But the system has a way of dealing with that too, which brings us to Section 3, pathologizing resistance.
This is where we enter the realm of the truly absurd, but also the deeply tragic. We have to talk about Dr. Samuel Cartwright.
Dr. Cartwright, a respected medical professional in the South. In 1851, he publishes a paper in a well-regarded medical journal, and he identifies a new mental illness that he says is plaguing the black population.
He called it drapetomania.
And the symptoms. What were the symptoms of drapetomania?
The primary symptom was the uncontrollable urge to run away from servitude.
I'm sorry, it's just it sounds like a skit. It sounds like something from The Onion. Doctor, help! My slave wants to be free. He must be sick.
It sounds laughable to us now, But we have to respect the power of the system. Think about the internal logic. If you start from the premise that slavery is a benevolent, God-ordained institution, that it is the natural and best place for a black person to be, then you create a closed, logical loop.
Right. The loop is, slavery's good. Therefore, a rational person would want to be a slave. Therefore, if a person tries to run away, risking death, dogs, starvation, everything, they cannot be rational.
They must be insane. It's the only possible explanation within that worldview.
It pathologizes the desire for freedom. It turns a political act running away into a medical problem, a chemical imbalance in the brain.
And the prescription Cartwright offered was horrifying.
Yeah, what was the cure for drapetomania? Was it like therapy?
He suggested whipping the devil out of them, or in what he called severe cases, removing the big toes to physically prevent running. He framed torture as medical intervention.
I'm not hurting him, I'm treating his illness.
It's the feedback loop Harriot talks about. The system protects itself from critique. If you resist, you're crazy. If you fight back, you're a savage. There's no room for legitimate dissent.
And Harriot contrasts this pathology narrative with the reality of what resistance actually looked like, because it wasn't just individuals running away in a fit of so-called madness. It was organized, it was strategic, it was military.
He brings up the Stoner Rebellion as 1739. This is another one of those events that gets glossed over in textbooks as a riot.
Right, riot implies chaos, random violence, a mob.
But Harriot analyzes the Stoner Rebellion as a military operation. The leader was a man named Jemmy. And Harriot suggests, based on the tactics they used, that Jemmy wasn't just a field hand who snapped. He was likely a trained soldier from the Kingdom of Congo.
The Kingdom of Congo had a professional standing army.
They had fought civil wars. They knew how to use firearms. And look at what they did at Stono. They raided a store to get weapons and ammunition. But then they didn't just run wild. They marched in formation.
And they used drums.
And not just for morale. In many forms of African warfare, drums were used to signal troop movements and commands. They were communicating over long distances. That is military technology.
And they had a clear objective. They were marching south towards Spanish Florida, where the Spanish government had promised freedom to any escaped slaves from the British colonies.
It was a strategic retreat under fire. But the history books often stripped Jemmy of his rank. They stripped the rebels of their discipline and their strategy. Because if you admit that you are fighting a war against captured soldiers, it completely changes the nature of the conflict.
It's not master versus slave. It's captor versus prisoner of war.
A totally different moral landscape.
Harriot also highlights the Maroons, the communities in the Great Dismal Swamp.
This is a story that I honestly wish was a blockbuster movie. The Great Dismal Swamp, on the border of Virginia and North Carolina. It's a massive, treacherous wetland, snakes, bears, quicksand.
An impossible place to live.
And yet for generations, thousands of escaped black people lived there, freely.
They didn't just hide. They built a civilization. They built cabins on the high ground. They had economies. They traded timber and shingles with people on the outside. They lived free in the very heart of slave country.
It's basically Wakanda in a swamp, a hidden nation. But acknowledging the existence of the Maroons completely destroys the drapetomania myth. These weren't crazy people running into the woods to die. These were nation builders, creating a viable alternative society right under the noses of the planters.
And then, of course, there's the big one, the one that terrified the entire system, Haiti, the Haitian Revolution.
The system's ultimate nightmare.
Harriot argues you can't understand American history without understanding how terrified the U.S. was, and in some ways still is, of Haiti.
When Haiti won its independence in 1804, defeating Napoleon's army, the greatest military power on earth at the time, the U.S. response wasn't, wow, freedom, democracy, just like us.
No, it was absolute panic.
It was terror. They locked it down. They placed embargoes on Haiti. Thomas Jefferson refused to recognize it as a country. They wouldn't for decades. Why?
The contagion theory.
Exactly. They were terrified that if American slaves saw that black people could govern themselves, could defeat a European army, could build a functioning state, the entire narrative of needing a master would collapse like a house of cards.
So the system works overtime to frame resistance as either madness, like drapetomania, or savagery, like a so-called riot, but never, ever as legitimate political or military strategy.
Which leads us to the next logical question. Who is writing these books?
Mm-hmm.
Who is deciding that drapetomania is science and Stono is a riot? Who is the editor-in-chief of American history?
Section 4, the construction of national memory. And here enter the villains of the textbook industry, The United Daughters of the Confederacy, or the UDC.
Now, I know what some listeners might be thinking. The United Daughters of the Confederacy. You mean those little old ladies who bake pies and put flags on Confederate graves?
That's the image. A quaint, harmless social club for Southern belles. But Harriot positions the UDC not as a social club, but as arguably the most effective propaganda arm in American history. These women were absolute geniuses at branding.
Evil branding, but incredibly effective. They understood a fundamental truth. You don't win the war on the battlefield, you win it in the classroom. If you control what the children learn, you control the future.
Harriet introduces us to a woman named Mildred Lewis Rutherford. She was the historian general of the UDC in the early 1900s, and she created something called the measuring rod.
The measuring rod was a literal checklist. It was a censorship algorithm that she sent out to school boards and libraries across the country.
I want to read a couple of the points from this checklist because it is just wild. She said to reject any textbook that says the South fought to hold her slaves.
So rule number 1,
Right.
lie about the reason for the war.
Right. Reject any book that speaks of the slaveholder as cruel or unjust to his slaves.
Think about that. She wasn't asking for nuance. She was demanding a complete rewrite of reality to portray slave owners as benevolent patriarchs.
And another one. Glorifies Abraham Lincoln.
So even the president who won the war had to be downplayed.
And it worked. This wasn't just some angry lady's blog post. It worked.
It worked incredibly well. The UDC was a powerful lobbying group. They had immense social and political influence. They pressured school boards across the South, but also in the North. And publishers who wanted to sell books in big markets like Texas and Georgia, they changed the text of their books to meet the measuring rod.
So you have generations of kids, my parents' generation, your parents' generation, maybe even us to some extent, learning a version of history that was curated by a Confederate propaganda group.
This is exactly why so many people today genuinely believe the Civil War was about states' rights. That phrase didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was engineered. It was a massive, decades-long rebranding campaign to shift the focus from human property to constitutional liberty.
Harriet has this hilarious character, Uncle Rob, who pops up in the book to just cut through the nonsense. There's a segment called Uncle Rob Explains Like I'm a Racist 5-Year-Old.
Uncle Rob is the voice of unvarnished truth.
And Uncle Rob breaks down the heritage, not hate argument. He's basically saying, if your heritage is owning people, maybe get a new heritage. I don't celebrate my heritage of, catching the flu.
But Harriet points out the physical manifestation of this branding, too. It wasn't just in the books, it was the statues.
Right. We have this image that those Confederate statues in the town squares were put up right after the war by the grieving widows.
No. The data shows the massive spike in statue building happened decades later. There were two big waves. The early 1900s at the height of Jim Crow, and the 1950s and 60s during the Civil Rights Movement.
So they weren't memorials, they were do not enter signs. They were threats.
They were branding exercises. They were putting a physical stamp on the territory to say, this is white space, the racial hierarchy is still in place. It's the same principle as a dog marking a tree. It's territory claiming. It communicates to every black person walking past that courthouse. You might be legally free, but you are not in charge here.
So we have a system that erases black competence, pathologizes black resistance, and then institutionalizes a fabricated history to cover its tracks. But Harriet also touches on how this same pattern of extraction happens in culture, in things we consume every day.
Section 5, cultural rebranding and the soul food distinction.
This is the food and drink section. And it makes you hungry, but also really angry. It's the hangry section of the book.
The thesis here is simple. Cultural appropriation is an economic output of the system. It follows the exact same pattern as the rice. Extract the value, erase the creator, and then monetize the product.
Let's talk about the distinction Harriet makes between Southern cuisine and soul food. He says Southern cuisine is the monetized, high-end version. It's the restaurant with the white chef on the magazine cover, selling elevated shrimp and grits.
And soul food is the innovation born of necessity. It's the food made from the scraps.
Literally. Enslaved people were given the parts of the animal the white planters didn't want. The intestines, which are chitterlings, ham hocks, pig feet, oxtails, the throwaway parts.
And through sheer culinary innovation, using African spices, African cooking techniques like slow stewing and one-pot meals, they turned those scraps into delicacies. They created the flavor profiles that now define the entire region.
But here's the rub. Here's the system at work. When those dishes become profitable, when they become trendy, they get rebranded. Suddenly, shrimp and grits isn't poor people food or black food. It's low country Southern cuisine. and it costs $35 a plate.
The incentive is to disconnect the product from the creator. If you call it Southern, it belongs to the region. It belongs to everyone, but mostly the white owners and chefs who profit from it. If you call it soul food or black food, the credit and the financial royalty conceptually belongs to the black community.
And the whiskey story. Jack Daniel. We all know the bottle. It's an icon of Americana.
But for more than a century, the story was that Jack Daniel was a self-made genius who invented his special whiskey in the hills of Tennessee.
The reality, which the company has only finally acknowledged in recent years, is that he was taught by an enslaved man named Nearest Green.
Nearest Green was the master distiller. He taught Jack Daniel the Lincoln County process. That's the specific charcoal mellowing step that makes Tennessee whiskey distinct from bourbon.
And that process, charcoal filtration.
It has deep roots in West African water purification techniques. It's another technology transfer.
So Nearest Green is the Steve Wozniak of whiskey, and Jack Daniel is Steve Jobs. But for 100 years, only one of them was on the bottle.
It connects perfectly back to the Rice Coast example. The system loves the product, the whiskey, the rice, the music, but it cannot acknowledge the producer. Because acknowledging the producer grants them humanity and intellectual authority, which undermines the whole hierarchy.
So we've looked at the history, we've looked at the food, but Harriot doesn't just leave us in the past. He connects this explicitly to the crisis in perception we are living in right now.
Section 6. The interconnection analysis, connecting past to present.
He argues that you can't understand modern politics, the gridlock, the anger, the policing, the culture wars, without understanding this narrative infrastructure.
Specifically, he looks at the shift in political parties. We often hear the talking point, the Democrats were the party of the KKK, which is, historically true. The Dixiecrats were Democrats.
But Harriot says, stop looking at the labels and look at the demographics. Look at who the parties are trying to serve.
He talks about the Lily White movement. In the late 19th and early 20th century, the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, made a strategic decision. They realized they couldn't win the South with black votes alone. So they decided to abandon black voters to try and woo white Southern voters. They literally formed lily-white Republican factions to push black members out of the party.
Harriot's analysis of the two-party system is brutal. He says historically it hasn't really been Democrats versus Republicans. It's been the party of pro-white hegemony versus everyone else.
And the parties just trade off who is holding the banner of hegemony in any given moment.
The labels flip.
But the system's core goal, the maintenance of the racial hierarchy, remains the constant.
He also links this history of pathologizing resistance to the modern criminalization of black life. We have to talk about J. Edgar Hoover.
Hoover is the ultimate system administrator. He rises to power during a period called the Red Summer of 1919.
The Red Summer. This was a period of intense racial terrorism, white mobs attacking black communities in Chicago, Washington, D.C., and the horrific massacre in Elaine, Arkansas, where hundreds of black sharecroppers were killed for trying to form a union.
Now, in a neutral world, the police would arrest the mobs who were attacking citizens. But Hoover flipped the script. He framed the black response to this terrorism. Black people defending their homes with guns as subversive and a threat to America.
This is the reframing again. Resistance equals pathology, or in this case, subversion.
He argued that any black demand for equality was a communist plot. He created the framework that black political organization is inherently a threat to national security. This birthed COINTELPRO,
the counterintelligence program.
It led directly to the illegal surveillance of Martin Luther King Jr., the assassination of Fred Hampton of the Black Panther Party. The policing structures we have today, which view black activism with extreme suspicion, think about the institutional response to Black Lives Matter versus the response to other protests, are the direct descendants of Hoover's reframing of the Red Summer.
It's the drapetomania of the 20th century. Why are you protesting? You must be a radical subversive. You must hate America.
Exactly. And on the flip side of that criminalization, Harriot talks about the black church. But not just as a place to pray.
No. He calls it a structural adaptation.
Because black people were shut out of every other institution, politics, schools, social clubs, banks, the church became the nation within a nation. It was the school, it was the political hall, it was the bank, it was the insurance company.
It was the only place you could be fully human, the only place where you weren't called boy or girl, but deacon or mother. It conferred status and dignity.
Exactly. And that is why the dominant system constantly tried to infiltrate it, bomb it, or burn it down. From the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in 1963 to the burning of churches in the 90s, the system recognized the church as a rival power structure.
So, bringing this all home, we've covered a lot of ground. The settler myth, the theft of expertise, the pathologizing of resistance, the propaganda of the textbooks, the rebranding of culture, and the political realignment.
It is a massive, interconnected web. But when you step back and look at the whole map, as Harriot forces you to do, the crisis in perception becomes crystal clear.
The crisis isn't that we don't know facts. The crisis is that we are looking at the outcomes, poverty gaps, incarceration rates, wealth inequality, and we think they are accidents.
Or worse, we think they are the cultural feelings of the people suffering from them. We say, why is there a wealth gap? And without this history, the answer defaults to, well, maybe they just don't work hard enough.
But when you read this book, you realize, oh, wait, someone stole the boots, and then they stole the leather to make the boots, and then they wrote a textbook saying they invented boots, and then they passed a law saying it's divisive to talk about the boot theft.
Laughs. That is a remarkably accurate summary of the system. Systems persist not because they are invisible, but because their architecture feels normal. The statue in the park feels normal. The name Southern Comfort on a liquor bottle feels normal. The chapter in the textbook feels normal. Harriot's work is like a hammer that shatters that normalcy.
It forces you to look at your world and ask, what am I looking at right now that I think is neutral, but is actually a powdered wife?
That is a haunting image to end on, but a necessary one.
We have to give huge credit to Michael Harriot and Black AF history. The book is thick, it's dense, but I want to emphasize it is also laugh-out-loud funny. We didn't even get to touch on his concept of why typology.
Laughs. We'll leave that for the readers to discover. But yes, he manages to be rigorous and irreverent at the same time, which is a rare and powerful skill.
Absolutely. Go get the book, borrow it from a library. It's not just a history lesson, it's a manual for seeing the Matrix.
It's necessary reading for anyone who wants to understand the country they're actually living in, rather than the one in the brochure.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.